Hi, this is Charles again. In this video, we're going to talk about demand. Now, you've come across this concept before, heard it several times in this course by now, but I think it's time we drill down a bit and think more carefully about this concept of demand. The term demand means something quite specific in economics. One way to define demand is that it refers to the quantities of a good or service that potential buyers are willing and able to buy. Now, importantly, potential buyers are people who intend to buy a good or service and have the means to do so. In other words, potential buyers refer to people who intend to actively participate in the market. There's also an important distinction between the concepts of demand and want. A want is not necessarily a demand. A want is only a demand if there is both the intention and means to act on that want. So I might want an Italian sports car, but lacking the means to acquire one, I am not in the market for one, and therefore my want does not come towards the demand for sports cars. Demand should be understood as a flow concept. In other words, it is measured over a specified period of time. And that period could be a day, a week, a month, or a year. This is important. Imagine I say that I demand 2 slabs of chocolate. Well, that doesn't really tell you much. Do I demand 2 slabs of chocolate today, which would make me somewhat of a glutton? Or do I demand 2 slabs of chocolate over my lifetime, which would make me somewhat ascetic? Anyway, it's important when discussing demand to always specify a given period of time. Another aspect of the demand concept is that it relates to the plans of market participants and not necessarily events that have already occurred. This is important because demand can in fact differ from what actually gets bought and sold in a market. Like many other concepts you've experienced in economics, demand can be expressed in several different ways. We can use words, we can use tables, we can use graphs, or perhaps most succinctly, we can use equations. We can also distinguish between individual demand and market demand. For the remainder of this video, we'll focus on individual demand, and in the next video, we'll move on to market demand. And for the purposes of this illustration, we'll consider one person's demand for tomatoes. We'll call this person Ann Smith. So, recalling our definition of demand, our objective here is to determine the quantity of tomatoes that Ann is willing and able to buy. And to do that, we might think of all of the factors that would explain her demand. In other words, the determinants of demand for tomatoes. One of the most important ones might be the price. Surely this will have an influence on the quantity of tomatoes that Anne is willing and able to buy. We might imagine that at some extraordinarily high price, Anne might not be willing to buy any tomatoes at all. We might then guess that as price comes down, Anne would be willing to buy more and more tomatoes. So we may reasonably suspect that there's a negative relationship between the price of tomatoes and how many tomatoes Anne is willing and able to buy. Another factor that might be important would be the price of related goods, specifically the price of substitutes and the price of complements. Now let's imagine that Anne wants to use her tomatoes to make a salad. It could be the case that she considers pineapple to be a reasonable substitute for tomatoes in her salad. In that case, the price of pineapple might influence her demand for tomatoes. If the price of pineapple is favorable relative to the price of tomatoes, her demand for tomatoes might be less than it otherwise would. Also, the price of complements might be important. So if Anne is making a salad, she might need some lettuce. If lettuce are very expensive, she might not be willing to buy too much lettuce, which would in turn influence her demand for tomatoes. Now, of course, If Anne is making something like a tomati bridi, that's a tomato stew, then complements might not be that important in her calculus. Another factor that is important for Anne's demand for tomatoes would be her income. If her income goes up, she might be likely to buy more tomatoes, whereas assuming that tomatoes is a normal good. If tomatoes is considered an inferior good, then her demand for tomatoes will of course decrease as her income goes up. Other factors that might influence Anne's demand for tomatoes include tastes or preferences. So the higher the preference for tomatoes in her household, the higher we expect her demand to be. Likewise, the size of the household may be important. If Anne had a relatively large household, many kids, we might expect her demand for tomatoes to be higher than is the case if she had a small household. And of course, there are many other factors that may influence Anne's demand for tomatoes. And you can think of all kinds of factors. But you might be asking the question, where's supply in all of this? Shouldn't supply be one of the important determining factors? And the answer is not really, at least not directly. So let's imagine that the number of tomatoes supplied in the market is low. What this would mean is that there'd be a shortage in the market for tomatoes. This shortage would in turn impact on price. It is then the price of tomatoes that affects Anne's demand, not necessarily the supply directly. Okay, so now we have some basic framework or model for thinking about the factors that influence the quantity of tomatoes demanded by Anne and her family. So in words, we can say that the quantity of a good demanded by an individual or household depends on, or is a function of, the price of the good, the price of related goods, the income of the individual household, their preferences or tastes, the number of people in the household, and any other possible influence. And we can express these in symbols, as illustrated on this slide. We can then use those symbols to express a demand function or a demand equation, which is given on this slide. QD, quantity demanded, is a function of the price of a given good, the price of related goods, that is to say substitutes and complements, individual income, the tastes or preferences of households, and the size of a given household. Now, in this equation, the dependent variable would be QD, and all of the other variables would be what we call independent variables. That is, the variables that determine or explain the dependent variable. Earlier, I stated that we can name any number of factors that influence Anne's demand for tomatoes, but we just mentioned 5 to keep things simple. Now we're going to go even further. We're going to make things even more simple. We're going to stick to just one factor that determines demand. And that factor will be, you guessed it, price. We're going to focus on price exclusively, as we believe this to be the most important factor determining the demand for a good or service. Now, with that in mind, we can state the following law of demand, which is, other things being equal, the higher is the price of a good, the lower is the quantity demanded. This slide completes the different ways of expressing demand. In the bottom left, we have a table or demand schedule, which shows how the quantity demanded changes as price changes. Notice that as price goes up, quantity demanded goes down. The same information is then captured in the graph at the bottom right. So there we have the graphical expression of demand. On the vertical axis we have the price of tomatoes, on the horizontal axis the quantity demanded for tomatoes. Again, notice that as the price goes down, as it decreases, the quantity demanded goes up. In other words, there's a negative relationship between the price of tomatoes and the quantity demanded. The demand equation on this slide is virtually identical to the one seen 3 slides up, but for one small difference, which is the bars above the independent variables except for price. What this indicates is that we are holding these determinants constant. In other words, when we analyze quantity demanded as a function of price, we are assuming that all other factors that influence quantity demanded are being held constant, and we can therefore ignore them in the analysis.